How long until Germany gets a government? How long until America goes bust? How long until Iran gets a nuclear bomb? How long until there's peace in Ukraine? We're going to look at all of this and more on today's Trumpet World. Welcome back to Trumpet World. In addition to hosting this show, one of the other things I do is teach international relations at Herbert W. Armstrong College. And the college is having its retreat and camp out this weekend, but the news still goes on so that we can keep giving you updates. We're here, we're in a little more relaxed setting, we've got a cup of cocoa, and we're still going to work to give you the best rundown of the news that we can. Now, of course, pretty much the biggest news that we've been talking about this in the weeks running up to this, is Germany just voted. Germany had their election, and Joshua Michels and I did a whole show on it on Wednesday, but I want to try and condense, summarize, and give you a quick update at the start of this show. So Friedrich Merz won, and he will almost certainly be Germany's next chancellor. He leads the center-right Christian Democratic Union. He didn't do massively well, though. So his party came in first place, but it was still a pretty small vote historically for his party. The government that was in power did terribly. That was led by the Social Democrats. Social Democrats got 16%, basically their lowest vote in history. You kind of have to go into the uncharted territory of the 19th century when German politics was very different and still kind of forming to find a worst performance. And they have been rewarded by this terrible performance by being invited back into government, albeit as a junior coalition partner. So that's not for sure yet. There'll still be several weeks of coalition wrangling before an agreement is finalized, but that's the only viable coalition. You do the maths, and I mentioned last time you can go on Deutsche Welle and find, if you look at like the election in graphs, you can kind of try and work out coalitions for yourself. There just isn't anything that works. Christian Democratic Union could come together with the Alternative for Deutschland, this far-right party. They'd have a majority if they do that. They've said they won't, and so the Social Democrats is their only option. They couldn't do a coalition with the Greens. In theory, they could do it with basically the Greens and the Communists, but quite obviously they're not going to do that. Greens, Communists, Social Democrats, they can't form a coalition. It's pretty much just this one option. They're still going to kind of play hard to get. Both sides are still going to try and get the most from the coalition agreement and the priorities, but that's pretty much the only shot. There are other, if they really can't get things hammered out, we can go into more uncharted territory. We could have a minority government, potentially with AfD support, fresh elections, this kind of thing, but left-right coalition seems like the most likely option at this point. One thing we could have been clearer about on Wednesday's show, Olaf Scholz was the chancellor candidate for the left-wing party, the Social Democrats. He wasn't the leader. So this means that even though kind of Scholz is definitely out of the picture, they don't need to have leadership elections, and that leadership will continue going for now. That will smooth the way for some of the coalition negotiating. So you have a weak left-right coalition. They have the slimmest of majorities, so it's going to be very hard for them to get anything done. Just about a dozen rebels from either wing of the party, actually I think about half a dozen from any party, would be able to stop what the government is doing. And then also you've got to think that Friedrich Merz has spent the last few years, and then certainly the last election, trashing the SDP. They're like the main rivals. He's been talking about how terrible they are for months. Now they've got to come together and form a government. Like, this is not at all easy. Then another important factor to understand is that to amend Germany's constitution, you require a 2/3 majority. So the German people are demanding dramatic change from this election. To give them that change, you would need to make constitutional changes. You get all of the mainstream parties together. So Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, Greens, Free Democrats, I guess they didn't even make it into parliament, but you get everyone in the mainstream, everyone who's not basically a neo-Nazi or a communist, you still don't have a 2/3 majority. That's going to make it really, really hard for them to make any big changes. The biggest change that Friedrich Merz has said that he wants is revamping Germany's military. The easiest way to do that would be to change Germany's constitution and let them borrow more money to spend on the military. That's going to be very hard. It does look like Friedrich Merz is laying the groundwork to declare a state of emergency, which just requires a simple majority vote, and that could unlock a whole lot more cash. So I think that's something that we could see happen. But overall, we're going to be stuck in a bit of coalition chaos. Now I'm joined by Mihailo Zekic, who's standing by to do his segment here on the Middle East. But I think you also had a comment on what we're seeing in Germany.
Yes, so I think it's interesting. People talk everything that's going on, as you mentioned, that this is really uncharted territory for the German government. But in one sense, it's uncharted territories maybe since 1945, but for the German government's history, this is a very, very well-trodden path, which is why it's so worrying. There are a lot of echoes between what we're seeing right now and the late 1920s, early 1930s, where for people that aren't familiar with the history, you saw the Nazis and the communists rise at the expense of everybody else. The mainstream parties were trying to hobble coalitions together with each other, and they'd fall apart within 6 months or a year and back to other elections. The current system of government that Germany has, which was basically drafted by the Allies after World War II, was basically designed so whatever happened back then could never happen again. So it could not have another insurgent or ascendant Nazi party or communist party, etc. Which is why you have, say, for example, the 5% laws, which is now getting rid of mainstream parties instead of the extremists they were supposed to get rid of, which is why you have it's so hard to make constitutional amendments to Germany. And the very fact that you're seeing such a similar scenario when this system actually worked pretty good for a while, when you had basically two major parties and one smaller party, and you had a really long-term chances, you had political stability. Germany was the definition of political stability in Europe. That's basically all going out of the way, and we're seeing return to 1930s, not just in how hard it is for the grand coalitions to come together, but how ascendant these extremist parties are, how you basically have to have, if I could use this terminology, emergency decrees passed by the executive government to get anything done. This is a very, very worrying sign historically.
I'm glad you mentioned that's a really important piece of history to bring out. And we're watching history repeat itself in some ways. We're not necessarily expecting the AfD leader to take over and become the chancellor, but it's absolutely the same dynamic. And like we talked about on Wednesday's show, what we are expecting is for a strong man to come along and take advantage of this coalition chaos. You have so many dramatic events going on in Europe right now. You have this war in Ukraine now going on for 3 years. You have the United States that, rightly or wrongly, has bankrolled Europe's security for decades. And that is gone. That's a crisis for Europe. You're seeing attacks coming so regularly now, stabbing attacks, car ramming attacks from migrants from the Middle East. So everywhere you look within Germany, you are seeing crisis and turmoil, and really throughout all of Europe. So there's demand for a strong leader. This election won't have given them a strong leader. I think Merz is probably going to be a stronger, more capable leader than Schulz. But he doesn't have the support, and he doesn't have the majorities that he's going to need. I think you see that one of the things that he's started to do even before getting a coalition together is basically look at setting up a German Doge, this Department of Government Efficiency run by Elon Musk. So what he can do, like he can't pass laws yet, he doesn't have the coalition yet, but he can fire off requests to government departments saying, hey, I want to see where all of the money is going, just like Elon Musk is doing. So he seems like he's getting ready to do some big cuts. Great, good for him. I think every country could benefit from that approach. So yeah, great, fantastic. But doing a Doge is hard. You look at the United States and you look at all these courts shutting down what Donald Trump is doing and how hard it has been to move that forwards, how much energy it's taken. And Donald Trump has a Republican majority in the House. He has a very slim, but still there Republican majority in the Senate. Yet it's still really hard. What about when you're in Merz's position and you don't have a majority? And this is something that his coalition partners would not be at all keen on. They're the equivalent of the Democrats, of the left, that are all for big government. So Merz is not going to be able to rise to the scale of the occasion. And so what Mr. Flurry has said for years, and we had a whole bunch of these quotes, I think, on the show last week and back on the Wednesday show, Mr. Flurry has for years said, watch for a strongman to take advantage of a weak coalition government and come to power through coalition maneuverings in an undemocratic way, that there'll be a crisis, they'll need strong leadership, and he will be able to use that coalition chaos to come to power. And being on the road, we don't have all the clips that we would usually play for you at this point, but that is a very important prophecy to watch, and that comes right out of Daniel 11, that talks about the rise of a strong man in Germany, and he comes into power by flatteries. They don't give him the honor of the kingdom, as it says in the King James. He comes into power through back scenes maneuvering instead of a straightforward, normal process, which in Germany, in a democracy, would be winning an election. And we have our free book, A Strong German Leader is Imminent, that will talk about that more. And you can read that, prove for yourself that Daniel 11 is talking about that strong man. You don't take my word for it. You turn to Daniel 11, it's not going to mention Germany. How do we know this is about Germany? Well, that booklet will help you see that. But I think the other thing that's just so remarkable is that we have so quickly seen a push now from Merz on getting Germany nuclear weapons. That is kind of huge and astonishing. That he hasn't... The election was less than a week ago, and we have had real movement towards this. So on Friday, it was actually right after we finished recording the show. I did miss going live for that this last week. Friedrich Merz got up, and what he said, we need to have a discussion with both the British and the French, the two European nuclear powers, about whether nuclear sharing, or at least nuclear security from the UK and France, could also apply to us. So we need to talk to Britain and France, but see whether we can share their nuclear weapons. Politico noted this would be a huge shift in position, a major strategic shift for Germany. And then right away at the start of this week, the Telegraph had a story from a high-ranking French diplomat that they left anonymous, saying France is ready to follow through. And this official reportedly said, posting a few French nuclear jet fighters in Germany should not be difficult and would send a strong message. My understanding is that on the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, on Merz's side, the thinking is we need a nuclear umbrella, we want to have a say in this, we should be ready to talk about this, we are willing to pay for it. And then he also said that part of the reason France is going to do this is to pressure Britain to do the same. If the French move to place a nuclear deterrent in Germany, it would indeed increase pressure on the Brits to follow suit, he said. And we talked about this briefly on Wednesday's show again, so you can look at that for more information. But one of the points Mr. Flurry made is we had a lot of similar points from Mr. Macron. He's talked about sharing French nuclear weapons, offering them to Germany several times. And he talked about bringing together a European military. Friedrich Merz said, well, when I come to power, my top priority, my absolute priority, is to revamp the German military, to make us militarily strong. And in the past, Mr. Flurry said, well, Macron is saying these things because a German leader can't say them. Now a German leader is saying exactly the same things. Germany doesn't feel like they have to hide behind that French cloak anymore. They can just come out and say these things. And you look at the response, and I think that's absolutely correct. The world is cheering these requests from Germany. Nobody's particularly alarmed. Now, of course, all of this is happening as well in the background of this break between Europe and the United States. And the United States really pressuring Europe to spend more on its military and basically telling them, look, we're not going to subsidize you anymore. And again, I've got a lot of sympathy. America has done massive things for Europe. Europe was not invaded by the USSR because of the United States military presence, and because of the United States nuclear umbrella. And America basically told the world, hey, if you invade West Germany, we will nuke you, Russia. And that's what kept West Germany safe. There is a huge debt of gratitude owed, I think, to the United States for that and for defeating Russia in the Cold War. So I have a lot of sympathy for Americans wanting to spend less on the military, but the way that this is being done, pushing Germany now to become, and pushing Europe to become a military superpower to replace the United States, Donald Trump is pushing for a Europe that spends dramatically more on its military than the US does. That is incredibly dangerous. That is empowering this military machine that the founders of NATO said we want to keep them down. We don't want to empower them. When Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt said we want to forever prevent this from happening. So this nuclear discussion is taking place in this background. where one threat that Donald Trump could pull is, hey, Germany, you get on board, do what we want with tariffs or with whatever it is, or we will take our nuclear bombs out of Germany, because America has about 20 nuclear bombs within Germany. Well, now this takes away the leverage. That would give the US a lot of leverage over Germany. But if France says, hey, well, if you take away the American bombs, we'll step in right away, that kind of negates that threat. And so France is, by making this offer and by leaking it to the Telegraph, and I'm sure that was a deliberately done thing, they are undermining America's position in negotiations with Germany. And they're actively helping and supporting Germany against the United States. And this is something that Mr. Flurry has warned about for years and years as well. France under Macron is wholeheartedly supporting a European military with nuclear weapons, he wrote last year. But little does France know to what end Germany plans to use this power. He said that eventually France will finally find out what Germany has been planning all along. France will be shocked to see what its betrayal of Britain and America has caused. And there's critical Bible prophetic reasons to watch for this. We talk about on this show quite a lot that Britain is descended from Israel, America is descended from Israel, and you can see proof of that in our book, The United States and Britain in Prophecy. But France is also descended from Israel. France is descended from the tribe of Reuben. And the Bible records a lot of history here because there's prophetic trends. And there's even explicit prophecy in Genesis 48 and Genesis 49 that is, the Bible says, for the last days. But in one of the bits of history that's recorded there, Joseph's brothers, and Joseph is the father of Britain and America, Joseph's brothers betrayed them. France didn't have the courage to stand up for Joseph, but he didn't want to see Joseph completely betrayed either. So he tried to kind of work his way around it. He convinced them not to kill Joseph, but then while he was away, Joseph was sold into slavery. And he was kind of aghast at what had happened, but it's too late. And this is a type of what's going to happen. France is part of this rising Holy Roman Empire. You can see the way it's going to be one of these 10 kings that is rising in Europe, in this European superpower. That means they'll be betraying Britain and America. And Mr. Flurry makes the point, well, they probably don't see the full extent of that betrayal. They are right now empowering Germany and against Britain and America. They don't see the full extent of what it leads, and when they do, they'll be shocked. But that's an important prophetic trend to watch. And Mr. Flurry's article, France's Deadly Ignorance About Germany, is an important place where you can go, you can read more about that and understand more about this vital trend. Well, just to run down another few important pieces of news. I mentioned the appetite for a strong leader. We've also seen the appetite for a strong German leader coming from outside of Germany. So NATO's Secretary General, Mark Rutte, he said it's vital that Europe step up on defense spending, and your leadership, talking to Friedrich Merz, will be key. Then the EU, basically their top diplomat, their foreign minister, Kaja Kallas, she said the German people have made a choice and now they need to put together the government. I hope they do it as fast as possible because we really need to move on with the decisions on the European level that require German participation. It is remarkable to see a lot of people from all around Europe saying, Germany, lead us. We need you to have a strong leader so that we can get stuff done. I talked about a similar story earlier, but Rheinmetall is converting 2 factories to make weapons. So they had a couple of auto part factories. Now they're retooling them to make ammunition and ammunition casings and parts. This comes after you had a train factory repurposed to make tanks. I think we're going to see this a lot more in Germany, where they're saying, well, we're going to step up our military dramatically. They're having some industrial problems right now. There are factories shutting down. Volkswagen hasn't shut down a factory in Germany in its history, I don't think. And they narrowly avoided shutting 2 down. This is a big deal, even as a point of national pride, as well as just economic necessity and not wanting unemployment. So we have factories that aren't operating at capacity. We need to dramatically remilitarize. Well, there's an obvious solution to that. You retool the factories to make weapons. And we've just seen 3 factories now in the last few weeks, and there was even a study that came out a couple of weeks ago saying, well, this is very feasible. So I think watch for this to accelerate. That could be a huge trend in Germany rearming and becoming a major military superpower. Well, that's it from me, from what is happening in Europe with our kind of slimmed down crew and approach this week. We're going to get a recording from Andrew Miiller in the United States and Jeremiah Jacques, also in the United States, but covering Asia. We'll stitch that together, and then after that we'll come back to Mihailo and talk about the Middle East.
Yeah, I think the big news in the Anglo-American region this week is the new budget that the House of Representatives just proposed. America has been hurling towards bankruptcy for decades and is nearing the stage of its debt cycle where we don't have much more time to turn this around. Now, this week, the U.S. House of Representatives voted on a budget resolution that's basically trying to put out a blueprint for our spending for the next 10 years. It hasn't been approved by the Senate yet, but it definitely shows the direction the Republican Party's thinking. And this particular budget resolution cuts spending by $2 trillion over the next decade, so roughly $200 billion per year. There's some budget increases in both border security and defense, but most of the cuts are going to come from Medicare, Medicaid, and other welfare entitlement programs. So normally that would be some good progress. I mean, I think the debt problem's serious enough that it'd be good if there were more than $200 billion a year cuts. But any cuts are good. The main problem with this new Republican budget blueprint is even though it cuts the budget by $2 trillion over the next 10 years, it cuts taxes by $4.5 trillion over the next 10 years. So I'm sure a lot of American people will be grateful for the lower tax burden. It'll stimulate the economy. It may even grow the GDP somewhat. But some simple mathematics here, if you cut spending by $2 trillion and cut taxes by $4.5 trillion, you're still increasing the deficit by roughly $200 to $300 billion per year. And there's actually only one Republican in the House of Representatives that's been calling this out. When this budget resolution passed the House, every Democrat voted against it because they didn't want to cut spending. The Democrats are the party of high spending. But only one Republican, a representative from Kentucky, Thomas Macy, voted against it for a very different reason. His comment was, the GOP budget extends the 5-year tax holiday we've been enjoying, but because it doesn't cut spending much, it increases the deficit by $300 billion per year compared to letting the tax cuts expire. Over 10 years, this budget will add $20 trillion to the U.S. debt. So big picture, the Republicans, they're cutting spending, but they're cutting taxes by even more. Therefore, the deficit's still going up. Thomas Macy is one of the few Republicans in Congress sounding the alarm on this issue because we are reaching the part of the debt cycle where this is an existential crisis. Tucker Carlson recently did an interview with one of the largest hedge fund managers in the United States, Ray Dalio, who basically explained it this way. He said the United States is nearing a point where it's going to suffer a financial heart attack. And then explained that, like, you've probably heard the expression that credit is the lifeblood of a nation, or credit is the lifeblood of a business. Well, if credit is the lifeblood, then debt is like plaque in your arteries. I'm going to break this down to this because this is actually a really good analogy. So last year, the United States ended the year with $36 trillion in national debt. That money was made by that money was borrowed by selling treasury bonds. So $8.9 trillion, about a third of the national debt, was due last year. And so in order to pay off the $8.9 trillion, the United States sold $10.7 trillion in new treasury bonds. So we borrowed $10.7 trillion in new debt, used $8.9 trillion of it to pay off our old debt, and still had $1.8 trillion left over, which was what our deficit was last year. So now, next year, because we borrowed more money, we actually are going to have, like, let me find the exact number here I brought, 8.9 trillion. It's going to be somewhere with $9.2 trillion in debt's going to come due. And we're scheduled to run a $1.9 trillion deficit. So now we have to buy $11.1 trillion more dollars in treasury bonds. Each year, the amount of treasury bonds we get is bigger until we're finally at a point where half of our budget deficit is just interest on the national debt. So if you're comparing debt like plaque on your arteries, if half of your deficit is interest, the main artery going into the left ventricle of your heart is half clogged, which any good doctor would tell you is putting you at a very high risk of a heart attack. In this analogy, the heart attack would come at the point when we could no longer find enough people to buy our treasury bonds to finance the debt. Like I said, this year we're going to have to sell $11.1 trillion in treasury bonds to keep this Ponzi scheme going. As the debt takes up a bigger and bigger portion of your national debt, nations are going to stop selling that. Now, Ray Dalio, who, like I said, he's one of the biggest hedge fund managers in the United States, a lot smarter on these matters than I am, and in his estimation, he told Tucker Carlson that he figures that if the United States doesn't cut its budget deficit in half before Donald Trump leaves office, he feels that the interest rate on U.S. Treasury bonds is going to spike so high that the nation will go bankrupt. So pretty much saying that, like I said, we've got 4 years if we don't, or at least get our budget deficit down from 6% of GDP to 3% of GDP. That wouldn't fix the problem, but it would at least kick the can down the road a little bit. That's not what this new Republican budget does. It's not taking steps to get our budget deficit down from 6% of GDP to 3% of GDP. It's actually making the budget deficit even bigger than it was under the Biden administration. It's just taking a different strategy to make it bigger. The Biden administration was increasing the deficit by constantly increasing government spending. The Trump administration, under consultation with Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, is cutting government waste, slashing government bureaucracy, and decreasing government spending, which is all good things, if it wasn't for the fact that they were cutting taxes by even more than they're cutting spending. If you cut taxes more than spending, the deficit still goes up. This is going to be a pretty unpopular message, but America's only run 5 budget deficits in the last 60 years. The late Tim Thompson, who used to do financial analysis for thetrumpet.com, always used to say that when your outgo exceeds your income, your upkeep will be your downfall. So you can think about that for a minute. But we're spending more than we're taking in taxes and hurling towards our downfall. This is an unpopular message, but actually, even if Elon Musk could cut $1 trillion from the annual budget, which is a high order, but even if he could do that, we're still actually going to need to increase taxes by $1 trillion per year in order to balance the budget deficit. So you're going to need spending cuts and tax increases both in order to keep America on a path to fiscal sustainability. That's not a message people like to hear, but it is a message that comes straight from the Bible. There's a couple of proverbs that apply equally to personal family finance or national finance. One says, "The wicked borrows and cannot repay." And another says, "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children," which is in Proverbs 13, verse 22. And so taking together, this is showing that this isn't just an unwise fiscal policy America's pursuing. It's actually a sinful fiscal policy America's pursuing. To borrow money that you have no plan to pay back is theft and is actively wicked. If you're actually following God's laws of finance, you should leave somewhat of an inheritance to your children and your grandchildren, which is not what America is doing. Not only is America not leaving an inheritance to their children and their grandchildren, they're basically selling their grandchildren's generation into servitude in order to pay for things now. The Federalist magazine pointed this out once, and I thought it was really profound, that they said America's fiscal policy is not like a reckless spender who's running up his own credit card debt. It's like a grandmother who stole her grandkid's credit card and ran up that debt. She lives well until she dies, but the next generation is burdened with this enormous debt that they can never repay. A lot of the congressional representatives making these plans, they know that America's probably going to be able to keep buying treasury bonds for another several years. So this problem's not an immediate problem for them. But it will be an immediate problem to their children and their grandchildren. And so this is probably America's biggest national security threat, actually, because I mean there's a lot of other prophecies we talk about on this program about the Holy Roman Empire and the collapse of the American Empire, and foreign nations actually invading and enslaving America. But a lot of these other prophecies about foreign powers coming in and invading and enslaving America are only things that are logistically possible because America's bankrupt. You can't keep spending. You can't upkeep $1 trillion military when your country's bankrupt, or when you've got $11 trillion of debt coming due every year and no one's willing to sell treasury bonds. And so this issue is something that is actively leading to America's downfall. God has given America an amazing opportunity to turn this around with Donald Trump's victory and his appointment of Elon Musk to the Department of Government Efficiency and this enormous audit of the federal government, where we're now identifying ways we can cut federal spending and actually start moving to a point where we could balance the budget. But if this new budget blueprint's any indication, Republican lawmakers are squandering this really once-in-a-lifetime chance by cutting taxes even more than they're cutting spending, when what's required to stop this financial heart attack America's about ready to suffer is tax increases and spending cuts, both, to actually get a circumstance where your budget is balanced. If you don't balance your budget, it will destroy your personal finances, it will destroy your family's finances, it will destroy your nation's finances. And I think one article we can actually put in the show notes this week, an article we wrote for the Trumpet years ago, why Joseph should be in charge of the U.S. economy, using an example from the Bible about a wise biblical patriarch who saved 20% of his nation's money when times were good, so he had a cushion when times were bad, instead of running up enormous deficit like Joseph's descendants are doing today. So that's the big story I wanted to present from the Anglo-American region this week. In terms of a couple other relevant stories of just big news in the Anglo-American region, is that trade wars are heating up, with Donald Trump enacting a 25% tariff on both Canada and Mexico this coming Tuesday. And he's also increasing the existing 10% tariff on China to 20%. So moves that are designed to help fix America's trade deficit, but are also like escalating some of our tensions with other nations, particularly Canada, China, and Mexico, which have been involved in the trafficking of fentanyl into the United States, a scourge that actually killed 58,000 Americans in overdoses last year that the Trump administration is looking to crack down on. Meanwhile, in some other news that might actually make our military more efficient, so good news in that regards, the Pentagon has banned transgenders from the U.S. military. An official memo released on Wednesday said that all transgender troops are to be separated from other troops unless they receive a specific exemption from higher-ups at the Pentagon. And in more trade relation news, the United States and Canada are actually working together to help secure a vital trade route in the North Atlantic by conducting joint military drills in Greenland. That's an island in the North Atlantic that's heading towards elections next month, where they may very well end up declaring independence from Denmark. And so America and Canada are trying to telegraph their support for Greenland to the world.
The big story for Asia is that Russia's full-scale war on Ukraine has just hit the 3-month anniversary. So it was 3 years ago this week that Russian artillery and airstrikes began pummeling Ukrainian cities, and Russian tanks and troops, tens of thousands of them, started pouring across the borders into Ukraine. They invaded from western Russia, charging into Ukraine's east, and also from Crimea, moving up into southern parts of Ukraine. They also invaded from Belarus, charging down toward Ukraine's capital. Some Russians even came in from the Black Sea, coming across on warships. Russian President Vladimir Putin and most onlookers expected a quick victory for Russia, but of course we know now that they encountered far more resistance from the Ukrainians than pretty much anyone expected, and the war became a prolonged and brutal one that has really reshaped so much of the global geopolitical landscape. In terms of casualties, we can't pin down exact numbers because both sides tightly control that information, but a recent Wall Street Journal report estimated that 80,000 Ukrainians have been killed and 400,000 wounded. And for the Russians, the best estimates say it's probably twice those amounts and maybe even 3 times those numbers if you go by the Trump administration's estimates. So just really sobering casualty figures. And then on top of all of that, we've seen hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children forcibly relocated to Russia, where they are re-educated and Russified. So just a grave war crime there of massive proportions. As for the battle lines, they've changed very little in the last several months, but Russia today does control far less of Ukraine than it did back in the first month or so of the full-scale war. Back then, Russia controlled about 30% of Ukraine's territory, but it is now down to closer to 20%. And meanwhile, Ukraine invaded Russia's Kursk region several months ago, and Ukraine continues to hold a significant amount of Russian territory there. So Ukraine is still resisting, thanks largely to Western support, but there's no doubt that Russia is winning. And Russia continues to have the numbers on its side. And of course, Russia also has soldiers from North Korea assisting them. And there's also military equipment, weapons, and other gear coming in from North Korea, China, Iran, and other nations. So it's hard to know what might happen in the near term, but the big news lately is that US President Donald Trump is determined to broker some kind of a peace deal. President Trump has really shocked a lot of onlookers with his I guess you would call this part of his negotiation strategy, or maybe it's just his stance. But in either case, he seems to favor giving in to Russia in exchange for a temporary peace. And he called the Ukrainian president a dictator several days ago, which defied logic. But then just yesterday, he was asked about that in a press conference, and President Trump said he couldn't believe he had called President Zelenskyy a dictator. So it all feels a little bit surreal at the moment, a little bit chaotic, but some analysts are holding out hope that these are just negotiation tactics and that there is some sort of larger plan, some sort of better plan being worked out that we just don't know the details of yet. So we really just have to wait and see there. But one thing that we can be sure of is that whatever happens in the near term, we should expect Vladimir Putin to emerge from this politically intact and actually even stronger than he was going into it. And that's because of what Trump editor-in-chief Gerald Flurry has said about Putin's role in a coming Asian alliance. Several Bible passages talk about a massive end-time Asian bloc of nations. It's discussed in the books of Daniel and Joel and Revelation. And then there's one particularly detailed passage about this in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. Verse 2 of Ezekiel 38 says that this alliance will be led by a man who is called the Prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. That's how it's phrased if you look at the New King James Version. And Mr. Flurry has said since late 2013 that these names refer to Russia and then two of Russia's most important cities. And Mr. Flurry has maintained since then that this is describing Vladimir Putin. He explains all of that in detail in his booklet, The Prophesied Prince of Russia. And the booklet shows that Putin's most momentous days lie still ahead for him, and that his biggest wars lie still ahead. So however it happens in the near term, we should expect Putin to survive the current war and to go on to lead this Asian alliance into much larger wars going forward. And for anyone who would like to understand that, I hope that you'll go to thetrumpet.com and order your free copy of Mr. Flurry's booklet, The Prophesied Prince of Russia. And then there's a couple of other smaller Asian stories as well. First up, a quick story about North Korea, actually related to the war. A new report from South Korea's intelligence agency says that North Korea has recently deployed additional troops to Russia to fight shoulder to shoulder alongside Russian troops. So we know that last year North Korea sent some 11,000 troops there to fight with Russia, and there was some question at that time as to whether that would continue into 2025. But now we see that the deployments have continued into the current year. The numbers at this time are not known, but North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un has often assured Putin of his steadfast support for Russia's war, and here we see him making good on that promise. And then last up is a quick story about some people from China's Uyghur community who had escaped from China, and they were seeking asylum in Thailand. Thailand is supposed to be a United States partner, and the expectation was that Thailand would give these Uyghurs asylum in the nation or work out some other arrangement for them to get to another safe country. But this week, Thailand forcibly repatriated these 48 Uyghurs back to China, straight back to Xinjiang, China, where the Chinese Communist Party brutally controls the whole region. So these 48 people will now be facing extreme persecution, very likely even including torture in the concentration camps that the Chinese Communist Party runs in Xinjiang. So it's a very sad situation, and it shows that China is coming to dominate Thailand now to a degree that I think has taken many analysts by surprise.
Well, thank you very much for that, Andrew and Jeremiah. I haven't seen what you've recorded yet because I'm recording this first because of just the way time zones work, but I'm sure it's very good. And to conclude the show, we'll come back to our field location here in the UK, and we'll get an update from the Middle East from Mihailo Zekic.
Yes, the main story that is from the Middle East this week is on February 25th. Britain announced that they, as well as France and Germany, are ready to put snapback sanctions on Iran per the 2016 Obama-era nuclear deal. You might be thinking 2016, that was a while ago. What does this have to do with today? Donald Trump left the deal, of course. Iran has openly flouted the deal. Technically, the deal has never been dissolved, and the UK, France, and Germany, they were all guarantors of the deal. So technically, the deal still applies to them, and if they judge Iran to be violating that deal, which there's no possible way anybody could argue they're not, they can send a report to the United Nations, and that all of a sudden brings back all the pre-2016 internationally recognized sanctions that crippled the Iranian economy. You've seen President Trump, both in his first term and now, apply the maximum pressure so-called campaign and sanctioning Iran. That's all U.S. sanctions and threatening countries that do business with Iran, that if you buy their oil or etc., you won't be able to do business in the U.S. or have your assets seized, etc. In this case, this is internationally sanctions that hypothetically the whole world is supposed to enforce on each other. I say hypothetically because Russia and China have a way of turning the blind eye with these kinds of things when it benefits them, like say with North Korea, and Iran, of course, is no exception. But if this were to go through, this would be very, very bad news for the Iranian regime.
So I at least see a lot of headlines, say, about Iran and talk about sanctions and this and that. What makes this stand out? Is it the change in attitude for Europe? Because I certainly remember when you initially had the Iran nuclear deal, basically Europe was just like, hey, we want to trade with Iran as much as we possibly can. We don't even really care about the nuclear, but we just want permission to trade. America, let us trade. And it was always America was putting on the brakes and Europe was always trying to put on the accelerator, kind of no matter what. Is it the fact that you've now had the European foot moved to the brake pedal that's the noteworthy part of this? Or is it more the effect of what the sanctions could do?
There's actually a few angles to that. What you mentioned of Europe hitting the brake on it, that certainly is a big development, especially the fact that how the US and Israel have been bugging at least one of those three countries to do exactly just this for a while now, again, because Iran for years has openly flouted the agreement. But at this point, okay, maybe 10 years ago, everybody was really eager to do business with Iran. Iran was still a rabidly Islamist theocracy back then, but it didn't really have, how should I put this? It wasn't considered the big global pusher as it is today. 10 years, almost 10 years have passed, and since then we've seen Iran massively sponsor Russia's war in Ukraine through arms shipments, through experts on the ground in occupied Ukraine telling the Russians how to work the equipment, basically sponsoring the biggest land war in Europe since World War II. We've, of course, seen the attack on Israel through Iran's proxy Hamas, and all the ways Iran has attacked Israel and the wider West through its proxies. You've seen the Houthis disrupt maritime shipping through the Red Sea, which of course impacts Europe heavily. You've literally seen peacekeepers, European peacekeepers in Lebanon, clash with Hezbollah, Iran's proxy over there. It's pretty clear at this point that Iran's not... You think about Russia, for example. They'll do, before this whole war, they'll do certain things, they'll annex Crimea, etc., but they'll also offer Nord Stream 2, and a lot of people in Germany especially were willing to take advantage of this duplicitous nature, these backroom dealings. I think most people have awakened in Europe that Iran is not like that power anymore. Iran is very much in the anti-Western, we're going to be your enemy no matter what camp and no matter what deals we do with you, that's going to we're going to bite you back in the end. And the fact that Europe has awakened to that, not just with the nuclear deal, but again with sanctioning Iran for selling weapons to Russia, etc., I think that's basically common policy at this point across the board. That's one aspect. The other aspect is the circumstances with which how this ultimatum came about. It was actually given in a pretty roundabout way. The British ambassador to Israel, Simon Walters, he announced it actually at a conference in Tel Aviv. No statement from either government. So it was basically a small prepared speech for him at this conference that maybe not as many people were even paying attention to. But he basically said that if Iran doesn't get its act together, they will implement these sanctions in June. Why June? Well, technically the JCPOA expires in October, so this would be the last opportunity for anybody to do something if they wanted to. But also, and Walter has admitted this, they're hoping Iran to pressure Iran to get back to the table for another nuclear deal. He specified that the old JCPOA obviously didn't work, and what they want is something different. They haven't given any specifics per se on how they expect Iran to comply with this, etc. Although they admitted that they trust Iran's going to try and find ways to drag everything on. But he specifically cited the Trump administration's recent overtures about making a new deal as part of the motivation for this, and they're hoping to at least grease the wheels a little bit and maybe get something rolling, but sometime before the summer.
So if they did put sanctions in June, would those sanctions expire with the JCPOA in October, or would they continue?
From my knowledge, they would continue because this has nothing to do with the actual JCPOA. Those sanctions themselves, they're from
the
what,
UN.
Yeah, they're from what was before the signing of the agreements previously.
So you think that this is basically the Europeans trying to still be relevant and trying to make sure that in JCPOA 2 that comes from Donald Trump, it's not just a Trump-Iran deal, but that they're still sitting around the table.
That, and also to make sure a deal actually happens in and of itself. Because at this point, again, Iran's been flouting the deal for so long, they haven't really had any official pushback from, again, the parties that are technically still supposed to guarantee the deal. And Iran, for its part, okay, maybe they've been a bit whipped in the proxy wars with Israel. Hezbollah is more or less on its last legs, etc. But the nuclear program, which we'll talk about a little bit later, it's still going full steam ahead. And I mean, it seems like every second week on this program, we keep talking about a new development going in for that. They've put this part together, they've perfected this type of technology, and nobody's stopping them. And until somebody says something about it, Iran's not going to see a reason to need to stop.
So what is the big deal? Why are we watching this nuclear deal?
Aside from the fact that you have a crazy jihadist regime trying to get the most powerful weapons mankind has ever produced, from our perspective, from our angle, what sets Iran apart, say for example, North Korea or some of these, or even some other Muslim countries, is a prophecy in Daniel chapter 11, verse 40, which speaks of two end-time power blocks, a king of the north and a king of the south, clashing with each other. Keep reading through the rest of the chapter, you get to Daniel 12, and it talks about a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation. In other words, a world war stemming from this clash. And since the 1990s, our editor-in-chief, Mr. Gerald Flurry, has pointed to Iran and its leadership over radical Islam as fulfilling the King of the South prophecy, and the King of the North, going back to the days of our predecessor magazine, The Plain Truth, and Herbert W. Armstrong, we've identified it as a Catholic, German-led European bloc. To this point, we've seen Iran mainly talk about the great Satan and the little Satan, America and Israel. Europe has been sort of more of a side casualty to that, in as much as they support what America's doing and what Israel's doing. And Europe, for its part, as they've been eager to do business with Iran, they didn't necessarily want to be the countries that are going head-to-head with Iran. We're seeing that perspective change right now through the nuclear program, through through what's going on with Russia, through what's going on with Hezbollah and the war against Israel. Europe is seeing that they're going to have to, especially considering it's in their neighborhood, it's a lot closer, Iran's a lot closer to Europe than it is to America. They're seeing that they're going to have to take more and more direct action themselves. Regarding the nuclear program itself, there is no specific chapter, verse, and Iran shall get a nuclear bomb. But you put together circumstantial prophecies like this leading into World War III, another parallel prophecy, Matthew 24, verses 21 to 22, which talks about this war being, if Christ didn't put a stop to it, no flesh would be saved alive. This is talking about WMDs. You can expect, at the very least, this to be a part of the conversation. And Iran's part is the clash is prophesied to start through a push, a provocation from the King of the South towards the King of the North. With everything that's going on right now, Iran's been very pushy, not just to the West in general, but specifically to Europe. If they've combined that with even so much as one successful nuclear test, I mean, they don't necessarily need to get like a massive nuclear arsenal of missiles pointed at Europe. But if they just even had so much one test, that would be a game changer in itself. That you could be sure is going to spook Europe and many other countries in the world, and is going to hasten the prophesied clash between these two power blocks.
So an important prophecy to keep watching. Are there any other stories you wanted to update us from the Middle East?
Yes, there is. Tying into that, there's been some updates with the nuclear program in Iran in and of itself. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, released a confidential report, which a few details were released to the media, that Iran has now increased its stockpile of enriched uranium to 605 pounds. That's a 60% enriched uranium. 90% is weapons grade. It doesn't take much to bring from 60% to 90%, and there's no civilian application for 60% enrichment, so people know what they're up to. That's about 200 pounds more than what they had in November when the IAEA last issued a report like this. They mentioned the Director General Rafael Grossi, not at this Davos conference, but the last year, he mentioned that the best they could tell, Iran isn't necessarily going the next step with enrichment at this point. They're just sort of storing it in facilities to maybe keep in their back pocket, or maybe just increase attention for sanctions relief in exchange for a paper nuclear deal. Who knows what they're thinking. But the fact that they're making so much progress so fast, even without all this other talk from the European powers, is very much cause for concern. And one other story about an update with the Israel-Hamas war. Phase 2 negotiations of the ceasefire have commenced. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has sent, or has given the go-ahead for his negotiators to go to Cairo to speak with the Egyptians, who will speak on their behalf to Hamas, and vice versa, because Israel and Hamas won't talk to each other. With everything we've talked about in programs before of President Trump giving Mr. Netanyahu the green light to ignore the ceasefire terms and go in, you're not seeing the Israeli government taken up on that offer. And of course, there's a lot of public opinion or pressure on Mr. Netanyahu at this point. If you've gotten a few of them at this point, we just wait a few more days and we get everybody out. And I'm sure there's also other strategic considerations, like perhaps maybe waiting for Hamas to make the first mistake so Israel can claim clean hands when they go in to finish everything off. But there are, especially considering Mr. Netanyahu's track record of being very uncompromising towards terrorists, including from his own personal family experience with what went on in Uganda several decades ago. This is a little bit strange for him, I think, to keep the ball rolling with the ceasefire agreement, even when he has the American president supporting him. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes, but that's certainly something we'll keep an eye on.
All right, well, thank you very much for that, Mihailo. Thank you to you for sticking with us in a bit of an unusual format this week. Thank you to George Haddad, Victor Granados, and Isaac Lorenz for engineering and production. You can find all of the literature, all of the articles that we've mentioned on our website, thetrumpet.com. If you want to know more about Iran's nuclear deal, for example, The King of the South is a great little book to go and to, again, see for yourself why Daniel 11 is talking about this clash between Europe and this clash between Iran and radical Islam. Prove it for yourself. And you can do that with our booklet. And they're all free. We're happy to ship a copy to you for free. You can read it online for free. There's no catch. There's no data selling. There's no follow-up. We just want to get this truth out to the largest audience possible. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, you can get in touch with us, trumpetworld@thetrumpet.com. We'll be back with our regular Wednesday show next week. And until then, keep watching your world.